Alright, fair warning guys, it's over 100 degrees outside. I have to turn my AC off in order for the audio to sound any good, so please excuse if I start looking really sweaty. Music of the Year 2001. Now finally we get to talk about this channel's namesake, shoegazing, and its sister genre, dream pop. Now I've already explained what shoegazing is God knows how many times on this channel, but I guess I get to do it again because not everyone has seen the LSD and the Search for God video or any of the various 2 Beats Plus videos where I explain it. But basically, shoegazing was a subgenre of alternative rock that was founded in the late 80s and early 90s that utilized a bunch of effects pedals that caused its performers to constantly look down at the shoes, therefore the name shoegazing. There were some American bands and bands from other countries, but for the most part, shoegazing was very much a British thing. However, towards the mid-90s, shoegazing started to disappear, as bands such as Oasis started coming into the fray, proving that shoegazing's commercial success was no longer viable, so record labels kind of forced a lot of the bands to stop exploring that sound. However, if I were to be doing these videos all throughout the 90s, 1996 would be the last year that I would give shoegazing its own section. And then 2001 would be the next year where shoegazing would get its own section again. And the reason for that is because right around this year, shoegazing started seeing a new resurgence called new gazing. I'm not fucking calling it new gazing. You know what? Second wave shoegaze is fine. Now, a lot of resources tend to credit one specific band of whom I'll talk about in this video as bringing back shoegazing, but I think that's historically inaccurate, as much as I love that band. Honestly, it was just because the 2000s were starting to boom and bands were able to start experimenting a little bit more. We started seeing a lot more bands playing around with the genre again and not having to worry as much about commercial success because you could still make a decent amount of money with just a simple cult following. Heck, some people would tell you shoegazing never really went anywhere, as there are still several key releases even between 1996 and 2000. But 2001 was the year where we started to see shoegazing make a comeback. So let's go ahead and talk about 4 albums. Mercury Rev, All Is a Dream. Oh boy, I actually just got finished listening to this twice before starting this video. That's because I was talking about getting ready to film this and a friend told me, "Are you including that Mercury Rev album?" And I was like, oh, fuck, I didn't listen to it. And let me tell ya, I already kind of have an iffy history with Mercury Rev. Sometimes they use these really high, squeaky, falsetto vocals that just rub me the wrong way. And I have nothing wrong with falsetto vocals, I'm a Radiohead fan for Pete's sake. But when the other guy sings with the lower register, it's a lot more tolerable. Now I know it's 2 people that sing. One of them goes by the name Shady, the other one goes by Jonathan Donahue. Forgive me for looking down at my phone, I'm kind of doing my research as I move along with this one. But this album was actually pretty fucking good. They use like these swelling orchestras, and unlike previous Mercury Rev albums that I've listened to, it actually sounds tastefully done and not over the top. Not to mention the use of guitars and the arrangements in order to make this thing stick out pretty well. My favorite song on here was A Drop in Time. I actually found myself kind of singing along to it on the second listen. Hercules is a fantastic closer. Overall, I really recommend this thing. Maybe it'll be the thing that gets me into Mercury Rev finally. A-. Uwaga, Yeditranvaj, Lenny Valentino. Okay, I fucking butchered that. I guarantee it, I butchered that. Any of you Polish-speaking people in my audience, please don't give me too much shit for that one. This is a Polish album, not by a single musician, but actually by a band that calls themselves Lenny Valentino. And while I can't understand a single word that is sung on this album, I actually thought it was pretty okay. Pretty okay being all it really is, unfortunately. You have a lot of experimental soundscapes on here, and the vocals are pretty decent, but at the end of the day, it just doesn't strike me as anything all too particular in the world of shoegazing. The thing about shoegazing is sometimes you just get a lot of bands that don't really stand out all that much. It just sounds like another alternative rock band with their reverb turned up pretty high. Now I know a lot of people in Poland actually really cherish this album. It was pretty popular there. But for me, it just sounds like a bunch of experimental soundscapes that don't seem to go anywhere all too interesting. And I guess interesting is the strongest word I can use to really describe this album. That being said, it's nothing bad. I'm sure glad I listened to it, but that's all of the response that it really elicited from me. I'm just gonna give it a solid B and leave it at that. The Texas-Jerusalem Crossroads, Lift to Experience. Boy, oh boy, is that a mouthful. Lift to Experience, were/are, it's hard to tell if they're still together. They kind of came back together for a few years, but they never really announced that they broke up again. But they're a shoegazing band from Texas. Basically, they were a trio that gained a bit of a cult following and got the attention of two Cocteau twins, Robin Guthrie and Simon Raymond, both of whom did production work on this album. Now you're gonna need to excuse me as I'm citing something that probably doesn't have all that much factual basis. There was an old Amazon review that I found on this album that was allegedly written by someone who claimed to be Simon Raymond. And apparently his record label was being liquidated at the time, and it helped motivate him to get through the production of this album. Now if that Amazon review is anything to go off of, band arguments were abundant on this album. And what this album is it's a concept album, but a very good one at that. Now this is gonna sound silly, but I promise you it's executed brilliantly. How brilliantly? Well, I got a copy of this album on vinyl. And if I got a copy of the album on vinyl, that means I fucking love it. Now this is the reprint. The original version of this album is like kind of ugly looking in my opinion. I think this is actually a lot nicer. It's a lot more in your face. But it's a lot nicer, it looks less cheesy. But some people actually like it because this is supposed to be a parody of the way evangelical box art would look back in the day. Very cheaply thrown together. It fits the themes of the album. Now I'm just gonna read to you the first stanza of this entire album, and it'll tell you what the story is pretty quick. This is the story of three Texas boys busy minding their own business, when the angel of the Lord appeared unto them, saying, when the Winston Churchills start firing their Winston rifles in the sky from the Lone Star State, drinking their Lone Star beer and smoking their Winston cigarettes. You know the time is drawn nigh when the sun shall be lifted on high. We told them that didn't sound very Sunday go-to-meeting, when God calls the crippled deaf and blind to lead the children of Israel to the promised land. The children of Israel, we asked? Don't you boys know anything? The USA is the center of Jerusalem. Yup, this is basically a satire of evangelical culture in the United States. It's about the second coming of Jesus and the apocalypse taking place in Texas, which has been turned into the promised land. And let me tell you, with the way politics have gone in the last 20 years, this album has aged amazingly. But if you're paying close enough attention, you just start fucking laughing. This is the second funniest album of the year. We'll cover the first funniest when we get to the hip-hop section. But this thing is amazingly produced. This could easily pass for a post-rock album as well as a shoegazing album. The songs are long. If there's one thing that I have a complaint about this is that this album, you always have to have 90 minutes of your time to devote to it. But my God, is it worth it. These songs are all so amazingly composed and excellent. There's so much brilliant use of reverb and tremolo picking on here. Josh T. Pearson's vocals are very Jeff Buckley inspired and very non-breathy, which, along with the next album I'll be covering, is not typical for shoegazing. Neither is really having a concept to your album. Aside from Kitchens of Distinction's Death of Cool, I can't think of any other shoegazing album that's also a concept album. This is one of my favorite shoegazing albums of all time. Easy S tier. But it's not my most favorite shoegazing album of all time. It's not Loveless. It's not Rides Nowhere, although I love that one too. It's not Luscious Split. It's not A Place to Bury Strangers' Exploding Head. It's not any Dive album or Ringo Death Star or Catherine Wheel or any of those other bands that are usually referenced. Ladies and gentlemen, my favorite shoegazing album of all time is Fine Lines by My Vitriol. Bam, bitch. Rarest record I have in my whole collection. This thing cost me $120, and it was worth every penny. Well, worth every penny for bragging rights, because this thing kind of sounds like ass because of the production and it being a record that was released in 2001. No reprints, no other options to go by. This is all we got. A Japan-only exclusive vinyl release. So why is this thing my favorite shoegazing album of all time? Well, first off, let's talk about how this thing came into existence to begin with. My Vitriol were a band from Britain comprising of two people of Sri Lankan descent, one person named Sam Wardner, who is the vocalist, and another person named Ravi. I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce that last name. They met in college, worked as a duo, released an EP in 2000, and then recruited a bassist and a drummer. Now this is before the daughter of Ringo Starr started being their drummer. They gained some mild notoriety in Britain, having 4 songs that were mild hits, and some of you guys that were growing up at the time might remember some of them. And then they got the funds to start recording the album, and 2 of the members had to place it on hold because they had to complete their finals for the semester. But then they jumped right back on it, and this album gained a lot of hype when it was first released. So much hype that nobody even remembers how much hype this thing had. I mean, some of the reviews at the time were like calling it one of the best rock albums of the last 20 years. Yet nobody remembers this thing. And it's a shame, because for a shoegazing album, this doesn't sound like a typical shoegazing album. As a matter of fact, Sam Wardner had only heard of My Bloody Valentine, and he claims that they weren't even an influence on this album. As it turns out, they were just kind of this punky alternative rock band, and Sam Wardner liked playing around with effects pedals. The result is probably the poppiest, catchiest fucking shoegazing album I have ever heard. And most certainly one of the most aggressive without going into metal gaze territory. If you like the Foo Fighters and just wish that they had that tiny little spark of reverb behind them, this is right up your alley. Sam Wardner's vocals are amazing. His melodies are just, oh man, yes, those vocal melodies. Every time a chorus comes in, it's like this could have easily been a #1 hit song if this thing were marketed properly. Now, this album did get a re-release in the US and a remix, as well as a second disc called Between the Lines. Between the Lines has some nice touches, including a Madonna cover and an acoustic version of Always Your Way, which is easily one of my favorite alt-rock songs of the 2000s. But if you've ever struggled with shoegazing because it just didn't sound catchy or poppy enough, give this thing a shot. It wasn't intending to be a shoegazing album. It turned out to be an accidental shoegazing album. And that's exactly why I love it so much. The mild complaints I have about shoegazing are kind of answered by this album as a result. The vocals are strong instead of breathy. It's allowed to be aggressive and rocky where it wants to. Only complaint I have about this is that the American version is even worse produced than the British version. We already have issues with brickwalling on this. For those of you that are unfamiliar, brickwalling is basically when things are made so loud that just ruins the listening experience for some people. But bitching about brickwalling in this era of music is just redundant because everyone was fucking doing it. And that's part of the reason why my vinyl copy just kind of sounds crappy. Like, even like streamed versions of the album sound better than that. Please give it a shot. This thing is so underrated. I know a lot of shoegazing fans think that that's a controversial opinion to call this good, but give it a fucking shot. Easy S tier in one of my favorite albums of all time. That about does it for this episode. I'll see you guys next time when I cover a genre that's gonna be a lot beefier and a lot longer. See you later.